"Put that rifle down before you hurt yourself, sweetheart." Ryan Caldwell said it loud enough for every man on the firing line to hear. Avery Callahan didn't put the rifle down. She chambered a round. The Barrett M107 50 caliber, 32 pounds of battlefield destruction locked into her shoulder like it had been built for her body specifically. "Sweetheart left the building," she said. "You want to step aside? Or you want to still be standing there when I break your range record?" Nobody laughed this time, because her hands weren't shaking. Not even slightly. Subscribe to our channel and follow Avery's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Nevada desert in August does not forgive weakness. It punishes hesitation. It amplifies doubt. It takes everything a person believes about themselves and burns it down to whatever is actually true underneath. The heat rises off the earth in visible waves, and the air tastes like iron and chalk. And the wind shifts without warning, and it does not care who you are or where you came from or how hard you trained to get here. Avery Callahan had known all of that before she arrived. She had done her research. She had studied the terrain reports, the weather patterns, the average wind speeds for the Naval Special Warfare Precision Rifle Assessment Range in Arizona during summer qualification cycles. She had printed topographic data and spread it across her kitchen table in the small apartment she rented outside of Coronado. And she had spent 3 nights cross-referencing elevation changes with ballistic coefficient tables until the numbers stopped being numbers and started being something she could feel in her fingertips. She was 19 years old. She had not yet figured out how to make her car insurance payments without her phone reminding her twice. But she could calculate a wind drift correction for a 0.5 caliber round at 2,500 yards to within 1/10 of a MOA, and she had been able to do that since she was 16. These two facts existed in the same person simultaneously, and the world had never quite known what to do with that. The Naval Special Warfare Precision Rifle Assessment was not an open competition. It was an invitation-only evaluation run 3 times per year, designed to identify extraordinary marksmanship talent from across the military branches and route that talent toward the Naval Special Warfare Sniper pipeline. The candidates who showed up were not rookies. They were not people who had wandered in off the street because they thought shooting sounded interesting. Every man on that firing line had qualified for the assessment through performance records that had been reviewed, scored, and approved by a selection board that did not pass candidates out of generosity. Avery had received her invitation 6 weeks earlier. She had read it 4 times before she believed it was real. Then she had called her older brother Marcus, who was stationed at Camp Pendleton, and he had listened to her read the entire letter aloud over the phone. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know what's going to happen when you walk in there," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "And you're still going?" "Marcus," she said patiently. "When has what people think ever changed what I do?" He laughed. A short and tired sound. "Fair enough. Call me when you break something. I intend to." She hung up and went back to her ballistic tables. The morning of the first assessment day, Avery arrived at the range 40 minutes before the required check-in time. She had done this deliberately. She wanted to be there when the others arrived. She wanted to observe the facility, identify the wind indicators, note the position of the sun and the angle of shadow across the firing positions, and do all of this before anyone was watching her closely enough to comment. She had parked her truck, retrieved her gear, and was in the process of setting up her equipment at the designated staging area when the first group of operators arrived together, 3 men in their late 20s and early 30s. Moving with the practiced ease of people who had been doing this for years. They saw her immediately. The first one, a stocky man with a red beard and a name tape that read Hartley, stopped walking and stared at her case. "Is that a Barrett M107? He said. "Yes," Avery said without looking up. Hartley looked at the other 2 men. "She brought a 50 cal, he said, as if reporting something medically unusual. The second man, taller, with a shaved head and the careful posture of someone who had been corrected by instructors too many times to slouch anymore, read the situation quickly and chose to say nothing. His name tape read Okafor. He stored his judgment somewhere quiet and moved to his own staging position. The third man said everything Hartley was thinking but wouldn't commit to. "How old are you?" he asked directly. Avery looked up then. He was built like someone had assembled him from components that were all slightly too large, wide shoulders, thick forearms, a jaw that looked like it had been designed to absorb impact. Name tape read Caldwell. 19, she said. 19, he repeated the number like it tasted wrong. "And you brought a Barrett M107 to a Naval Special Warfare Sniper assessment." "That's what I did," she agreed. "You know what that rifle weighs?" 32 pounds empty, she said. 41 with a full 10-round magazine, bipod, and Schmidt and Bender scope. I've been carrying it in weighted pack configuration for 2 years. My legs are tired of that conversation. Caldwell blinked. Then he smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile that meant he respected her. It was the kind of smile that meant he had decided she was interesting. The same way a person might find an unusual insect interesting, momentarily curious. Ultimately not concerned. Okay, he said, we'll see. He moved away. Avery went back to her equipment. By 800, there were 11 candidates on the range. They represented 3 branches of military service, multiple years of combined deployment experience, and every variation of the kind of person who finds their way into elite marksmanship programs, quiet technicians, physical specimens, men whose faces had been arranged by years of stress into permanent expressions of calm vigilance, and Avery. The youngest candidate was the man standing to her left, Marine Scout Sniper candidate named Delaney, who was 23, and who introduced himself by immediately offering to help her carry her case, an offer she declined without breaking stride, which seemed to confuse and impress him in equal measure. Master Chief Daniel Mercer arrived at 802. He walked the line without saying anything for 30 full seconds, looking at each candidate the way a carpenter looks at lumber, not with judgment exactly, but with assessment, trying to understand the grain, figuring out where the stress points were. When he got to Avery, he paused. His expression did not change. Callahan, he said. Master Chief, she said. You're the youngest candidate this range has seen in 11 years. The last candidate who came in at 19 washed out on day 2. I read his assessment report, Avery said. He was rushing his exhale. His fundamentals were inconsistent under fatigue conditions. Mercer looked at her for another moment. And yours aren't? My father made sure of that, she said quietly. Something moved across Mercer's face, then not softness exactly, but a small acknowledgement, the kind that happens when someone says something true in a room full of performance. Moved on down the line without another word. But Avery noticed that he had paused slightly longer at her position than any of the others. The first day was not shooting. The first day was always physical and cognitive evaluation, land navigation, equipment management, stress response testing, a written examination covering ballistics, meteorology, observation technique, and mission planning fundamentals. Avery moved through the physical components without drama. She was not the fastest candidate, she was not the strongest. She finished the 2-mile run in the middle of the pack, behind Caldwell and 2 others who clearly lived inside a gym, and ahead of Hartley, who ran with the labored determination of someone who had accepted that his upper body development had come at a cost to his aerobic capacity. She made up ground on the written examination. The proctor, a quiet senior enlisted man named Petty Officer First Class Donovan, collected the papers at the end of the time window and didn't say anything to anyone. But when he picked up Avery's examination, he glanced at her first page, and his eyes moved in a way that suggested the first answer was either very right or very wrong, and he wasn't going to confirm which. The physical evaluation required candidates to carry their primary weapon systems across a 4-mile route with elevation changes, moving through 3 observation posts and completing a written terrain analysis at each one. Avery carried the Barrett the entire route. No one asked her to. No one required it. Candidates were allowed to stow heavy weapons in a support vehicle and carry a secondary weapon for the movement phase. She chose to carry the Barrett anyway. At the second observation post, Caldwell caught up to her on the trail and fell into step beside her without being invited. "Why are you carrying that?" he asked. "Because it's mine," she said. "The movement phase doesn't require primary weapon carry for systems over 30 pounds. I know. So you're carrying 41 pounds of rifle for no required reason." "I'm carrying it," she said, "because when I'm on a real position someday and I've been moving with that rifle for 6 hours and I need to make a shot immediately, I don't want my arms to be surprised." Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "That's actually smart," he said, and he sounded almost annoyed that he'd said it. "Thank you, Petty Officer Caldwell, Ryan," he said. She didn't respond to that. They walked in silence for another 2 minutes before he dropped back. That evening in the briefing tent, Master Chief Mercer delivered the assessment parameters for the week. The candidates would progress through a series of qualifications, each one building in complexity and distance, wind reading, moving target engagement, low-light scenarios, multiple threat prioritization. The final qualification would be held on day 7. Mercer described it briefly: a single steel target, fixed position, distance to be announced at the time of engagement. "What's the distance range?" Delaney asked. "I'll tell you when you're on the firing line," Mercer said. "What if the distance is beyond standard assessment parameters?" Someone asked from the back. Mercer looked toward the back of the tent. "Then you'll know you're being tested for something beyond standard assessment." The tent went quiet. Caldwell leaned toward Hartley. "He hasn't changed this format in 9 years," Caldwell muttered. "Something's different." Hartley shrugged. "Or he just likes watching people sweat." Avery said nothing. But she was already calculating what kind of distance might sit beyond standard assessment parameters, and what wind data she would need to collect over the next 6 days to build a reliable picture of this range's atmospheric behavior, and whether the position of that distant target marker she had spotted during the morning movement phase aligned with the direction of the prevailing late afternoon wind. She pulled out a small notebook. She began writing numbers. The man to her left, Okafor, who still hadn't said much to anyone, glanced at her notebook. "Meteorologically," he asked quietly. "Wind speed by time of day," she said. "Started collecting this morning." Okafor studied her for a moment. "That's a 6-day data build," he said. 7, she corrected. "Final qualification is day 7. I need 1 entry from that morning before I fire." He nodded slowly. "Thorough. My father called it earning the shot before you take it." Okafor thought about that. Then he pulled out his own notebook and wrote something down. 2 began with a wind reading exercise. The candidates were positioned at firing lines at 1,000 yards from a target array, and their task was to calculate current wind speed and direction using only environmental observation, no instruments, no weather apps, no unit-provided data. Then they would record their estimates. Then they would fire. Then they would see how close the bullet's point of impact was to the correction they had calculated. Most candidates were accurate within acceptable range. 2 candidates were significantly off. They had read the surface wind correctly, but failed to account for the altitude shift at the 600-yard mark, where the terrain changed and the wind behavior changed with it. Avery had noticed that terrain change during the morning movement the previous day. She had marked it in her notebook with a small arrow and the words, "Wind shear point, recalculate mid-flight compensation." Her first shot at 1,000 yards hit within 2 inches of center. Instructor Rodriguez, who was running the wind reading evaluation, walked to her position and looked at her scorecard. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he wrote something on his own clipboard. "How'd you spot the shear point?" he asked. "Vegetation movement differential," she said. Scrub at ground level was moving left. The grass at the top of that ridge was moving right. The divergence point is approximately 580 yards downrange. Any round traveling past that point needs to be calculated with a modified wind value. Rodriguez looked at the ridge. He looked back at her. "What was your father's specialty?" he asked. And it was the first time anyone on the range had known enough to ask that question. "Scout Sniper," she said. 3 tours, 2 of them training indigenous marksmen in environments with no standard ballistic data available. He built his own tables for every theater, and he taught you to do the same. "He taught me that conditions are never the same twice," she said. "Calculation is always new, the rifle is the same. The math is always different." Rodriguez nodded. He moved on to the next candidate. But later that afternoon, when the candidates were at rest and Avery was reviewing her notebook, he heard Rodriguez talking quietly to Master Chief Mercer near the observation post. He couldn't hear the full conversation. She heard 3 words clearly: "The Callahan girl," and then Mercer's voice, quieter still. She didn't catch his response, but she wrote the time in her meteorological log, 1,547 hours, and noted that the wind at that moment was running 3 knots out of the northwest. Trouble started on day 3. Not with the shooting, with the tent. The candidate shared a dormitory-style sleeping facility, and there were 2 separate areas, one for female candidates, one for male. Avery was the only female candidate, which meant she had her own area, which was quieter and slightly larger than it needed to be, and which she appreciated because the extra space gave her room to spread out her ballistic tables on the floor each evening. What she didn't appreciate was the conversation she heard through the shared canvas wall at 2,230 hours on day 3. She recognized Caldwell's voice immediately. "I checked her record," he was saying. Pause. "Partly," she thought. "Bonding and." "She has a conditional invitation," Caldwell said. "Do you know what that means?" "It means someone flagged her file for consideration outside normal candidacy parameters. Some admiral's office pushed her invitation through." "You don't know that," Okafor's voice. "Even and careful. Why else would they bring a 19-year-old with no service record?" "She has a qualification record," Okafor said. "I looked it up. Junior ROTC National Championship. 3 years running. She won the Inter-Service Youth Marksmanship Competition at 17. She competed at Fort Benning against active-duty qualified snipers and placed 2nd overall at 18. A pause. "Second," Caldwell said. "To a master sergeant with 22 years of service," Okafor said. "She was 18. He was 41. Silence. Then Caldwell. Lower now. That still doesn't mean she belongs here. Then let the assessment decide that, Okafor said flatly. That's what it's for. Avery listened to the silence that followed. She could have been angry. She chose not to be. Anger was a temperature change in the body, and temperature changes in the body affected muscle tension, and muscle tension affected breath control, and breath control affected the shot. Her father had taught her that anger was the most expensive thing a shooter could carry. She set it down. She picked up her notebook instead and reviewed her wind data from the afternoon. The northwest wind had shifted 2 degrees toward north between 1,400 and 1,600 hours. She wrote that down. She calculated what that pattern would mean for day 7. She wrote that down too. Day 4 tested everything simultaneously. The exercise was called a stalking and engagement sequence. Candidates had to move from a concealed start position to a designated firing point without being spotted by 2 trained observation teams, establish a firing position, and make a precision shot on a moving target at 800 yards. The exercise had a time limit. It also had a noise limit. Any candidate who made audible sound above a specific threshold during the movement phase received an automatic score reduction. Avery moved differently than the other candidates. Everyone could see it, including Mercer, who watched the exercise from the observation platform with a pair of high-powered binoculars. The male candidates tended to move with controlled aggression, deliberate, purposeful, efficient. They had been trained in movement disciplines that emphasized controlled speed, systematic sector coverage, and decisive action. Avery moved like something that had decided not to be noticed by the world. It wasn't slowness. It was something harder to define, a quality of motion that seemed to reduce her presence rather than project it. She found angles that broke her silhouette at moments when the observation teams were sweeping toward her. She timed her movement to the intermittent wind gusts that moved the surrounding vegetation, so her own movement was masked within a larger movement. One of the observation team members, a petty officer, second class, named Torres, who had been running this exercise for 3 years later, told Instructor Rodriguez that he had lost visual on Avery at the 200-yard point and never reacquired her until she was already in her firing position. She was just gone, Torres said. I had eyes on the others the whole time. She disappeared. Rodriguez had written that down. Avery made her shot from the firing position 800 yards, moving target, light crosswind, and hit within 3 inches of center mass on the first round. She packed her gear quietly and moved back to staging. Caldwell had been watching. He didn't say anything when she passed him. But for the first time since she had arrived, he wasn't smiling. Day 5 brought something no one had planned. The weather changed. A weather system moved through the region overnight, and the morning of Day 5 began with wind conditions that bore no relationship to the previous 4 days of data. Gusting, inconsistent, shifting direction in twisicant cycles that made conventional wind reading almost impossible. The range safety officers delayed the start of training by 90 minutes. Most candidates sat in the briefing tent, drinking coffee and waiting. Avery went outside. She stood on the edge of the staging area with her notebook and a small handheld anemometer, a device she had purchased herself and packed in her personal kit, and she spent the 90 minutes building a new wind pattern model from scratch. The gusts came in sequences. She started timing the sequences. She discovered, after 40 minutes of data collection, that the gusts were cycling on a 17 to 20 second interval. The floor wind, the base wind between gusts, was running at approximately 6 knots out of the northwest. The gusts spiked to 14 knots and rotated toward the west-northwest before dropping back. It was a pattern, not a perfect pattern, not a predictable one in the way that a laboratory condition might be predictable. But it had rhythm, and rhythm was something she could work with. Delaney found her outside at the 45-minute mark. What are you doing? He asked. Building a gust model, she said. She looked at her anemometer, then at her notebook. You brought your own anemometer? My dad always said you own your own data, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Can I? He hesitated. Could I look at what you've got? She turned the notebook so he could read it. Studied the numbers for 30 seconds. 17-second cycles, he said slowly. So, if you fur in the first 5 seconds after a gust drops, the floor wind is clean and consistent enough to calculate, she said. You've got a reliable 5-second window before the next cycle begins. He looked at the sky. That's actually useful. You can use the data, she said. Window's the same for everyone. He looked at her strangely. Why would you share that? She looked at him directly. Because I'm not trying to beat you, she said. I'm trying to make a shot that nobody has made before. It doesn't require you to fail. He thought about that for a long time. When they went back inside, he quietly told Caldwell about the gust cycle. Caldwell listened, looked toward the door that Avery had walked through, said nothing. Day 5's shooting exercises went well for most candidates. 3 candidates struggled with the gust conditions and recorded their worst scores of the assessment. Avery recorded her best. She had fired in the 5-second window every time, and every shot had been where she intended. Master Chief Mercer reviewed the scores that evening alone. Then he called Instructor Rodriguez into his office. "Tell me what you know about her father," he said. Rodriguez had done his research. "James Callahan," he said. Master Sergeant, retired, Scout Sniper. Qualified in multiple theater environments. Died years ago. Cardiac event. She was 15. Mercer looked at the wall. "Who trained her after that?" "Herself," Rodriguez said. "She joined ROTC, but the marksmanship coaches there said she came in already trained. They basically just gave her a platform to compete. Everything she knows, the meteorological work, the ballistic tables. Docking, her father built that curriculum, and she finished it alone after he died." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "How much of what she knows did she build herself?" Rodriguez checked his notes. "The gust modeling she ran this morning. The wind shear identification on day 2. Stalking technique Torres described. None of that's in any course curriculum I've seen. She developed those independently." Mercer looked at the score sheets. "Pull the historical assessment records," he said. "I want to see where she ranks against the last 10 years of candidates at each stage." Rodriguez came back 20 minutes later. He laid the comparison on Mercer's desk. Mercer looked at it for a long time. "She doesn't know how good she is," he said quietly. "No," Rodriguez agreed. "I don't think she does. That's going to make day 7 complicated," Mercer said. Rodriguez looked at him. "How far are you moving the target?" Mercer said a number. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nobody has made that shot in field conditions. Not in this program, not in this environment, I know," Mercer said. "You're going to put her on it anyway." "I'm going to give every candidate on that line the same shot," Mercer said carefully. "Whatever happens after that is up to them." Rodriguez left. Mercer looked at the comparison sheet for a long time in the quiet of his office, and somewhere in his chest, in a place he would not have admitted to anyone on that range, something that felt almost like anticipation was beginning to take shape. Day 6 was wind, distance, and patience. The exercise was a long sequence of shots at escalating distances: 500 yards, 800, 1,000, 200, 1,000, 600, 2,000. For most candidates, performance peaked somewhere between 1,000, 200, and 1,600 and began to deteriorate beyond that. The physics of long-range shooting accumulated complexity with every 100 yards of additional distance. Wind drift multiplied. Bullet drop required more precise elevation compensation. The margin for error in breath control narrowed to fractions of a second. At 1,600 yards, 6 candidates hit center. At 2,000 yards, 3 hit center. One of them was Caldwell, one of them was Okafor. The third was Avery. After she fired at 2,000 yards and the spotter confirmed center, Avery set down the Barrett and did not look around at anyone. She picked up her notebook. She wrote, "Wind 7 KNNW. Drift correction. Moe the impact, confirmed center. Confidence at this distance high. Question for tomorrow. What does beyond standard actually mean to Mercer?" She underlined the question twice. Then she closed the notebook. She had one night left to think about it. That night, the candidates ate together in the mess facility for the first time as something that felt, not unified, then at least mutually respectful. The physical dynamics of the group had shifted over 6 days. The early easy division's experience versus youth, expectation versus performance had been complicated by the actual record of what had happened on the range. Caldwell sat down across from Avery without being invited. He looked up. "I said something to Hartley on day 3, he said. "I know what you said," she said. He paused. "You heard that canvas walls," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. "The Admiral's office theory," he said. "I was wrong about that. I looked up what you did at Benning. The Master Sergeant deserved to win that competition," she said. "He had 22 years of experience, and he shot brilliantly that day. Second place to him is something I'm proud of. You were 18. I was aware of that." He looked at her. "I've been doing this for 7 years," he said. "I've fired more rounds than I can count. I know what this range looks like at 2,000 yards. I've made that shot 4 times in my career." She waited. "You made it on your second trigger pull in a field assessment," he said. "Not on a controlled range, with ideal gusts. 15-second window between gusts," she said. "The floor wind was cleaner than it looked." "I know," he said. "You told Delaney about the gust cycle. It was useful information. You gave away an advantage." She looked at him steadily. "I don't think of it that way. How do you think of it?" "I came here to make a shot," she said. "I didn't come here to win a game." He looked at her for a long time. "What shot?" he finally asked. "What specific shot?" She picked up her coffee. Ask me again tomorrow, she said. After Mercer moves the target, Caldwell stared at her. You know where he's moving it. I have a theory, she said. What's your theory? She looked at him over the rim of her cup. That he's been thinking about this range's record for a long time, she said. And he's been waiting for a candidate who makes him believe the number is reachable. Caldwell was very still. And he thinks you're that candidate. I think, Avery said carefully, that he's going to give everyone on that line the same shot. And I think that what happens after that depends entirely on who shows up tomorrow with the right math. She put down her cup. She picked up her notebook. Excuse me, she said. I have 6 days of wind data to consolidate. She walked back to her quarters. Caldwell watched her go. He sat alone at the table for a long time. And for the first time in the entire assessment, Ryan Caldwell was genuinely uncertain what was going to happen next. That uncertainty felt important. He didn't know why yet. But it stayed with him through the night, quiet and insistent. The way the feeling before a significant event always does, not telling you what's coming, only telling you that whatever it is, it matters. The morning after that dinner conversation, Ryan Caldwell woke up 40 minutes before Revel. He didn't know why at first. He lay in the dark listening to the sound of the desert outside, that specific silence that isn't actually silence at all, just the absence of human noise, and tried to identify what had pulled him out of sleep. Then he remembered what Avery had said. Ask me again tomorrow. After Mercer moves the target, he sat up. She knew something. Or she had calculated something. And the distinction between those two things, he was beginning to understand, might not matter as much as he'd originally assumed, because with Avery Callahan, calculation and knowledge seemed to occupy the same space in her mind, feeding each other in a continuous loop that produced results he was running out of ways to dismiss. He had spent 7 years telling himself that precision shooting was primarily about experience, about the accumulation of rounds fired, environments survived, conditions endured, about the calluses that build up not just on your hands but in your nervous system, the way your body eventually stops reacting to pressure and starts simply processing it. He had fired more rounds than he could count. He had been on a real target at distances that made the work they'd done this week look like backyard practice. And yet he pulled out his own data notebook and opened it to the day 5 wind records. His gust timing was less precise than hers. He could see that now, comparing his entries to the pattern she had described to Delaney. He had identified the wind as irregular and gusting. She had identified a 17-second cycle with a predictable 5-second clean window. Same wind, same range, same 90 minutes of waiting. Completely different levels of information extracted. He closed the notebook. He got dressed in the dark and went outside to watch the morning come in over the desert. And he thought about his father, who had been a mechanic and who used to say that the difference between a good mechanic and a great one wasn't how many engines they'd rebuilt, it was whether they listened to the engine before they touched it. He had never applied that idea to shooting. He was 31 years old, and a 19-year-old girl had just taught him something about his own craft, without intending to teach him anything at all. That sat in his chest in a way that was uncomfortable and clarifying at the same time. Day 7 began at 600. The candidates assembled on the firing line in the cool of the early morning, and the air had that particular desert quality of being genuinely cold before the heat came, a cold that felt borrowed, temporary, like the land was using it on credit and would demand it back with interest by noon. Master Chief Mercer stood at the head of the line. He did not have a clipboard. He did not have notes. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the 11 candidates in front of him with an expression that gave nothing away. Today is the final qualification, he said. You've all performed across a range of conditions this week. Some of you exceeded my expectations. Some of you met them. Some of you showed me things I didn't anticipate. He paused. Nobody moved. The final qualification is a single shot. 1 round. Fixed position. He paused again. The distance will be confirmed when you are on the firing line. Not before. Hartley leaned slightly toward Caldwell. That's new, he muttered. Caldwell didn't respond. He was watching Avery. She was standing at the end of the line with her notebook open in her left hand. And she was not looking at Mercer. She was looking toward the far end of the range, her eyes tracking something in the distance that no one else seemed to be looking at. Candidates will fire in order of yesterday's distance scores. Lowest to highest, Mercer continued. You will each have 1 round. The firing order will proceed until all candidates have fired or declined to fire. Can we decline? Delaney asked. You can always decline, Mercer said. A declined shot scores 0. A missed shot scores, according to point of impact from center. A center hit scores maximum. The scoring breakdown has been posted to the assessment board. He looked down the line. Callahan. She looked up from her notebook. You fire last. The group shifted almost imperceptibly. Firing last wasn't a punishment, it was a position of visibility. Everyone who had already fired would be watching. Every result would already be on the board. The last shooter would know exactly what they needed to do. Mercer knew what he was doing, and from the way Avery looked at him, steady, unreadable, with a small nod, acknowledged exactly what the position meant. She knew it too. "Understood, Master Chief," she said. The first 4 candidates fired at a distance that Instructor Rodriguez announced as they approached the line. When he said the number, Hartley said God under his breath. It was beyond anything they had fired at during the assessment week. It was beyond the standard parameters Mercer had hinted at in the briefing on day 1. It was in a range that most precision shooters would have called ambitious under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. The morning wind was running inconsistent, not the gust cycle from day 5, but a different pattern, slower and more variable, which in some ways was harder to read because it didn't have the rhythm she could time. The first candidate fired. Miss high and right. The wind had pushed the round at approximately the 1,400-yard mark. Second candidate fired. Miss low, elevation miscalculation. The third candidate, a quiet Army Ranger candidate named Espinosa, who had been one of the stronger performers all week, took a long time to settle before he fired. His round clipped the edge of the target plate, not center, but contact. Confirmed, partial impact, outer ring. The tension on the firing line increased measurably. Espinosa had made contact at a distance that had already defeated 2 experienced shooters. That meant the shot was possible. It also meant everyone now knew how narrow the margin was. The fourth candidate missed. Then Hartley stepped to the line. Hartley was not a subtle shooter, he was a powerful, confident, technically sound marksman who relied on his fundamentals, and his fundamentals were genuinely excellent. He had placed in the top 3 on every distance exercise this week, up to 1,600 yards. He set up with deliberate efficiency, checked his data, settled into the rifle. He fired. The spotter watched downrange. "Silence," Miss Rodriguez said. 8 inches left of center. Wind pushed it at long range. Hartley stood up and stepped back from the line without a word. 6 once partial impact, 5 misses. Caldwell was next. Ryan Caldwell approached the firing position with the controlled composure of someone who had been in high-stakes situations before and knew how to compress his internal state into something manageable. He sets up the rifle. He reviewed his wind data. He thought about the 17-second gust cycle from day 5 and tried to apply that framework to the current conditions. Wind wasn't cycling today. It was drifting slow and inconsistent, 4 to 8 knots, shifting direction by 10 to 15 degrees over 30-second windows. He had to pick a moment. He waited. He watched the wind indicators, the range flags, vegetation movement, the dust behavior at the surface of the desert floor. He found what he thought was a clean window. He fired. The sound rolled across the range. The spotter watched. "Impact," Rodriguez said. 3 inches right of center. The line exhaled collectively. That was a real hit. Not center, but a genuine, meaningful hit at a distance that had destroyed 5 other experienced shooters. Caldwell stood up from the rifle and stepped back. He looked toward Avery. She was already looking at him. He nodded once, not triumphantly, but honestly, "That's my shot. Let's see yours." She nodded back. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote something down. Caldwell watched her write and understood, with a sudden cold clarity, what she was doing. She had watched his shot. She had noted the point of impact 3 inches right. She was using his miss to refine her own wind calculation. He had been using everyone's shots as data points all morning. Every miss, every partial, every result had been feeding her calculation in real time. He almost said something. He stopped himself, because it was brilliant. And because there was nothing to say. 3 more candidates fired between Caldwell and Avery. Okafor made center clean, quiet, efficient. He fired once, and the spotter called center hit. He returned to his position without celebration. He simply wrote something in his own notebook and stood at rest. Caldwell watched Okafor and then watched Avery watching Okafor, and he could see her updating her calculation again. Okafor's shot had confirmed something she was already computing. 2 more misses after Okafor. Then Delaney, who had been nervous all morning in a way he wasn't bothering to hide. Delaney fired, not center but solid impact in the scoring zone. He closed his eyes briefly and breathed out. "Good shot," Avery said quietly from behind him. He turned and looked at her. "You're up," he said. "I know. You ready?" She looked at him with an expression he would remember for a long time, not arrogance, not false calm, but something that resembled the face of a person who has spent years preparing for a single moment and has just recognized that the moment has arrived. "I've been ready for this shot since I was 15 years old," she said. Stepped aside. She walked to the firing line. The range went quiet in a way it hadn't gone quiet all morning. There's a particular silence that gathers around something that feels significant, not enforced. Not polite, but instinctive. The kind of quiet that happens when a group of people simultaneously understands that something worth watching is about to occur. Avery set the Barrett M107 into position. She opened her notebook to the last page of entries. She reviewed the morning's data. Her own wind readings from 545. The pattern she had tracked during the firing sequence. The corrections revealed by each preceding shot. Caldwell's 3-inch right drift confirming the mid-range wind at the moment he fired. Okafor's center hit confirming the brief window when the wind had dropped and stabilized. He had 7 data points from real rounds fired at real distance in today's actual conditions. Most shooters arrived at the line with theoretical calculations. Avery arrived with a model built from evidence. She set down the notebook. She settled into the rifle. Master Chief Mercer walked to within 10 feet of her position. He had not done this for any other candidate. He stood there and said nothing. Just watched her the way someone watches a thing they are not certain they will see again. Rodriguez was at the spotting scope. The line stood behind her. Avery looked down range. She breathed in, she breathed out. She found the wind. It was drifting at that moment 6 knots, bearing northwest with a slight lift that would affect vertical hold at distance. She noted the vegetation movement at 600 yards, the indicator flag behavior at 1,000, the surface dust pattern at 1,500. She built the shot in her mind, the way her father had taught her, not as a single calculation, but as a series of connected truths. The bullet was going to travel for several seconds. During those seconds, the world was going to continue doing what the world does. The wind was going to push, gravity was going to pull. The air density was going to exert resistance. All of those forces were knowable. None of them were stoppable. The only question was whether she had done the arithmetic accurately enough to account for all of them simultaneously. Her father's voice, clear and steady in her memory. The rifle is mechanical, the bullet is physics. But the shot is mathematics. And mathematics doesn't lie. She adjusted the scope. 0.4 mo, right of her previous calculation. She had spotted something in the way Caldwell's round had drifted that told her the wind at the 1,800-yard mark was slightly stronger than her morning reading had suggested. His miss had given her the correction she needed. She settled her breathing. Her finger rested on the trigger, not gripping, resting. Her father again, a trigger pulled is a trigger jerked. A trigger pressed is a trigger released. The round leaves the barrel the same either way, but your body doesn't know that. Press it like you're handing it something fragile. Pressed. The sound of a Barrett M107 firing is not a sharp crack. It is a concussion, a deep physical pressure wave that you feel in your sternum before you consciously register it as sound. It moves through the people nearby like something solid. Every person on that firing line felt it in their chest. And then they waited. The bullet was still traveling. At that distance, the travel time was long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough for doubt to enter, for second guessing to begin, for the mind to start rehearsing what a miss would feel like. Avery did not move. She stayed in the rifle, kept her eye at the scope, maintained her position the way her father had drilled into her, because the shot doesn't end when the trigger breaks. It ends when the bullet lands. Any movement before then is a betrayal of the work. Rodriguez was at the spotting scope. His voice, when it came, was quiet. A pause that lasted less than a second but felt much longer. Her hit. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mercer said, "Confirmed," Rodriguez said. "Direct center." The silence held for another 3 seconds. Then Caldwell said, "Jesus." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was the word that came out of him involuntarily. The way a word does when something happens that your brain hasn't fully processed yet. Hartley was staring down range as if he could see the target from where he stood. Okafor had his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, the posture of a man recalculating something. Delaney said nothing at all. He just looked at Avery, who had lifted her face from the scope and was sitting very still beside the rifle. She didn't celebrate. She opened her notebook and wrote down the result. Center hit. Wind correction confirmed. Model validated. Then she closed the notebook. Mercer walked to her position, stood beside her for a moment without speaking. "You used their shots," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Real data beats theoretical projection," she said. "Where did you learn that?" "My father built ballistic tables in theaters where no existing data was available," she said. "He said you always use the information the environment gives you. You never ignore a data point just because it came from someone else's failure." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "Stand up," he said. She stood. He looked at her for another moment, then said something she didn't expect. "Do you know what the range record is?" She knew the number. She had known it since before she arrived. Yes, Master Chief. Do you know how long it stood? 11 years, she said. Do you know who said it? She hesitated. Yes, she said. Say the name, Master Chief Daniel Mercer, she said quietly. During a 2013 advanced assessment, conditions described in the record as moderate wind, mid-morning, fall temperature. Mercer looked at her without expression. How long have you known that? Since I received my assessment invitation, she said. I researched the range history before I arrived. And you came here anyway. I came here, she said carefully. Because the record exists to be broken. Not out of disrespect, because that's what records are for. The line was listening. Every candidate could hear this conversation. Mercer said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then the record distance is 147 yards beyond where you just fired. The number landed on the firing line like something dropped from a height. Caldwell heard it and did the arithmetic involuntarily. He knew what that additional distance meant in terms of wind drift, bullet drop, timing margin. He knew what each additional yard added to the complexity of a shot that was already at the outer edge of what he had believed was achievable today. He looked at Avery. She was looking at Mercer. I'd like to attempt it, she said. Mercer studied her face. The conditions are different than 2013, he said. The wind is less predictable. You've already fired 1 round. Your data model was built for the distance you just shot. Not 147 yards beyond it I can extrapolate, she said. Can you? I need 10 minutes, she said, to rebuild the calculation. You have 7 minutes, Mercer said. Then the range closes. He turned and walked back to the observation platform. 7 minutes. Avery sat beside the Barrett and opened her notebook to a clean page. Caldwell walked to her position without being invited. What do you need, he said. She looked up. Your exact point of impact measurement, she said. Rodriguez gave me 3 inches right. I need to know if that was at the face of the target or adjusted for the angle of the shot. Caldwell didn't ask why. He walked immediately to Rodriguez, asked the question. Came back with the answer in 40 seconds. Face of the target, he said. Unadjusted. That means the actual wind drift at distance was closer to 3.7 inches, she said. And she was already writing. That changes my mid-range wind estimate by about half a knot. She wrote numbers quickly. Caldwell watched her work. He didn't understand every calculation, but he understood the discipline of it, the way she moved through the problem without pausing, without the second-guessing, without the hesitation that usually accompanied uncertainty. She wasn't certain, he could see that, but she was working the problem as if uncertainty was just one more variable to account for. Top Delaney came over. Then Okafor. Within 4 minutes, 5 of the remaining candidates were standing around Avery while she worked through the longest distance calculation any of them had ever watched someone build in real time, under a 7-minute deadline, for a shot that had stood unmatched for 11 years. The bullet drop at this additional distance, she said, talking partly to herself and partly to anyone listening, means I need to account for a secondary elevation correction that my scope's current 0 doesn't cover. I need to hold over. How much? Okafor asked. Calculating, she wrote. Paused, wrote again. 0.8 MOA above my current 0. If the wind holds where it is, been shifting, Caldwell said. I know. She looked at her watch. I need 2 more minutes of wind observation before I finalize the correction. She set down the pen. She watched the range. Everyone around her watched her watch the range. The wind moved through the desert in that slow, drifting way it had been moving all morning, not the dramatic gusts of day 5, but a subtler, more treacherous inconsistency that didn't announce itself. It required watching without blinking, reading without interpreting, letting the environment tell you what it was doing instead of telling the environment what you wanted it to do. 60. 90. There, she said quietly. Picked up the pen and wrote a final number. What did you see? Caldwell asked. The surface drift has a directional bias, she said. It looks variable, but it's not truly random. It keeps returning to a base bearing. If I fire in the 3 seconds immediately following a direction return, mid-range wind will be consistent enough to calculate. How do you know when a direction return is happening? She pointed to a point approximately 400 yards downrange. The vegetation cluster at that distance, she said. When it moves left, the wind is in a variable phase. When it goes still, the wind has returned to base bearing. I fire on still. Caldwell looked at the vegetation cluster. He watched it for 30 seconds. It moved left again. Went still. He felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. That's the window, he said. That's the window, she confirmed. He looked at her watch. 90 seconds left. She looked toward Mercer on the observation platform. He was already looking at her. She held up one finger. 1 minute, he nodded. She picked up the Barrett and began the final adjustments. The range had gone completely still. Not the enforced stillness of professional courtesy, but the involuntary stillness of people who have forgotten to move because they are watching something that has taken all their attention. Rodriguez had the spotting scope already set. Mercer stood on the observation platform with his hands behind his back, and his face was exactly what it had been all week, composed. Readable, but something in his posture had shifted. A slight forward lean. An attention that was different in quality from the attention he had paid to the other candidates. Avery set into the rifle. She was not thinking about the record. She was not thinking about Caldwell or Mercer or the 11 years of untouched numbers on that assessment board. She was thinking about her father, about a Saturday morning when she was 12 years old, lying flat on a hillside behind a .308 bolt gun, too small for the rifle and too stubborn to admit it. Her eye at the scope and her father's voice in her left ear. What's the wind doing? Fast. How fast? I don't know. Look at what it's moving, not at the wind itself. What's it moving? The grass. It's bending about 45 degrees. That's 12 to 15 knots. What does 12 knots do to your round at 500 yards? Pushes it right. 8 inches, not approximately. Approximately gets people killed. What does it do? 8.2 inches right at 500. Good. Now wait for it to drop. Tell me when. She had waited. The grass had moved, then slowed, then gone still. Now she had said, and she had fired, and she had hit. And her father had not said anything for a moment. Then where did you learn to read grass like that? And she had looked up at him and said, from you, Dad. And he had put his hand on the back of her head, brief and warm, the way he did when something mattered enough to touch. She had been 12 years old. He had been alive. She was 19 now. He was not, but he was here in the calculation on the page, in the grip of her hands, in the patience that lived in her bones. And she was about to fire the longest shot she had ever attempted. And she was going to do it in the window she had found, on the stillness she had identified, with the math she had built from a week of data and a lifetime of lessons. The vegetation cluster at 400 yards moved left. She waited. Her breathing was even. Her hands were motionless. Cluster moved left again. She waited. It slowed, went still. She pressed the trigger. The concussion moved through the line. Rodriguez was at the scope. The bullet was traveling. 3 seconds, 3.5, 4. Nobody breathed. Then Rodriguez's voice. And it was different from before, not different in tone exactly, because Rodriguez had good professional control but different in pace. It came slower, as if he was making absolutely certain of what he was seeing before he said it. Impact, a pause, direct center. He lifted his face from the scope. He looked at Master Chief Mercer. Center hit, he said again, quietly, as if saying it twice made it more real. Distance confirmed at record mark. Direct center impact. Mercer did not move for a moment. Stood on the observation platform and looked downrange in the direction of a target that was too far away to see with the naked eye, and something moved across his face, something that was not quite any single emotion but was made of several of them layered over each other, the way certain things are. Then he stepped down from the platform. He walked to the firing line. Avery was still in the rifle. She lifted her head from the scope and sat back on her heels, and she was quiet in a way that looked like she was listening for something. Mercer stopped in front of her. The entire line was watching. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That's my record you just broke." "Yes, Master Chief," she said. "How do you feel?" She thought about it. She thought about her father and the hillside and the grass bending in the wind at 12 knots. "I feel like I still have a lot to learn," she said. Mercer looked at her for another 5 seconds. Then he did something none of the candidates had seen him do all week. He nodded, not the professional acknowledgement nod he had used throughout the assessment, but something slower and more deliberate. The kind of nod that means, "I see you, I understand what just happened here, and I will not pretend otherwise." "Rodriguez," he said without looking away from Avery. "Master Chief." "Log the result and update the record board." "Yes, Master Chief." Mercer looked down at the Barrett M107 resting in Avery's hands. "Where did your father serve?" he asked. 3 tours, she said. "Afghanistan, twice, one in Iraq. He came home from all of them." She paused. "The last thing that got him was his heart, 2 years after he retired." "How old were you?" 15. Mercer was quiet. "He taught you everything you used this week?" "He taught me the foundation," she said. "Built the loan?" "After he was gone," she said.
Yes.
Mercer looked at her in the way that people sometimes look at something they were not prepared to see, not surprised exactly. Because surprise implies the possibility was unimaginable. And this was not unimaginable. It was simply something he had not made room for until it was standing directly in front of him. "You broke an 11-year-old record," he said, "with a rifle you've been carrying since you arrived. Data you collected yourself, and a calculation you built in 7 minutes. 6 minutes and 40 seconds, she said. He almost smiled. "How do you feel about where you placed in this assessment?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I didn't come here to place," she said. "I came here to find out if the shot was real, if the number I'd been calculating in my head for 2 years was actually achievable in field conditions." And she looked downrange, toward a target she still couldn't see. "It's real," she said. "The shot is real." Caldwell was standing 6 feet away. He had heard every word. He looked at Avery Callahan, 19 years old, carrying a rifle heavier than most people would attempt, having just done something that had not been done in 11 years, and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling on a firing range. Humility. Not the performed kind, not the kind you offer as a social transaction. The real kind. The quiet, uncomfortable, genuine kind that happens when someone shows you something you didn't know was possible and you cannot construct an argument against it, because the evidence is on the range board in black ink. He walked to her position. He didn't extend his hand. He said, "Your father would be proud." Avery looked at him. And for the first time all week through the dismissal, the doubt, the tent conversation, skepticism, the entire accumulated weight of being 19 years old in a place that had decided what she was before she fired a single round, her expression changed. "Not much." "I know," she said. And she picked up her rifle. And she walked back to the staging area. And she opened her notebook. And she wrote down the last data entry of the day. Wind at time of record shot, 5.8 knots. Bearing. Table. Window confirmed 3-second duration. Correction. Result center. She drew a single line under it. Then she closed the notebook. The assessment was over. But what was coming next, what Mercer was already thinking in the quiet of his own mind, what the result now logged on that range board was going to set in motion through channels and offices and decision-making processes that Avery didn't yet know existed, that was not over. That was just beginning. The range board was updated at 1,347 hours. Rodriguez climbed the 3 steps to the posted results display, pulled the laminated record card from its bracket, and replaced it with a new one. He did it without ceremony, efficiently, professionally, the way you update any administrative record. But his hands were slightly slower than usual, and the candidates watching from the staging area noticed that he paused for just a moment before he stepped back down, looking at the new card the way a person looks at something they want to remember. The new card read, "Callahan, Assessment Record, Long Distance Engagement Day 7, Current Assessment Cycle." Below it, the distance. Below that, the word center. Hartley stared at it for a long time. "She's 19, he said finally. Not the way he'd said it on day 1, not dismissively. Not with that edge of reflexive contempt. He said it the way you say something when the fact of it has stopped making the kind of sense it used to make. Like the number had lost its original meaning and hadn't yet found a new one. Caldwell said, "She is." They stood there looking at the board, and neither of them said anything else. Avery found out about the formal review board the same way she found out about most things in institutional settings, indirectly, through a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. It was the evening of day 7, 2 hours after the assessment had closed, and she was in the equipment cleaning area, working through the Barrett's standard post-firing maintenance sequence. It was work she had done hundreds of times. Her hands knew it without instruction: the disassembly order, the cleaning rhythm, the inspection points, the reassembly sequence. She could do it in low light. She could do it while holding a conversation. She often did it as a way of thinking, because the repetitive physical work freed something in her mind to move independently. She heard Mercer's voice from the adjacent corridor. He was on the phone. She didn't intend to listen. She wasn't positioned to listen. But sound travels differently in hard-walled institutional buildings than it does in open desert, and Mercer's voice, even at a professional low register, carried through the shared wall in a way that made his words clear enough to follow. "Result is verified," Rodriguez confirmed independently. "Yes, sir, by 147 yards. A pause. 19. Yes, that's what I said. Another pause. Longer. She built her own data model during the assessment. Wind logging, gust timing, real-time impact analysis from preceding shots. She was using other candidates' misses to correct her own calculation. A pause. No, that's not in any curriculum I've taught. She developed it. Another pause. And Mercer's voice dropped slightly. "Sir, I'm recommending immediate pipeline consideration. I understand the age parameters. I'm recommending we look at the parameters." A final pause. "Yes, sir. I'll have the full assessment report on your by 800. The call ended. Avery's hands had not stopped moving during any of that conversation. She continued cleaning the barrel. She continued with the bolt assembly inspection. She thought about the words age parameters and what kind of institutional structure they implied, And she thought about the word pipeline and what came after an assessment like this one, when the recommendation moved upward through channels she hadn't yet navigated. Then she thought about her father, who had always told her, "You can't control what the institution decides. You can only control the quality of the work you put in front of it." She finished the maintenance sequence. She packed the Barrett. She went to find Mercer. She knocked on his office door at 1921 hours. "Come in." She entered and stood in front of his desk. He was writing the assessment report, she assumed. He put down his pen and looked at her without expression. "Callahan, Master Chief, I need to ask you something directly." "Sit down," she sat. He studied her for a moment. "You heard the call." It wasn't a question. He had expected that. Mercer was not a man who missed the texture of a situation. "I heard enough," she said. "What did you hear?" "Age parameters," she said. "Pipeline consideration. A recommendation from you that someone above you is not immediately comfortable with." He leaned back. And I want to know what I'm actually being evaluated for," she said. "Because the assessment invitation was for a precision rifle evaluation. But the conversation I heard wasn't about a precision rifle evaluation. It was about something else." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right. It was about something else." He stood up and moved to the window, not to look out of it. Just to move, the way people do when they're organizing thoughts that don't fit comfortably into sitting still. "The ENT's precision rifle assessment feeds two pipelines," he said. "One is the standard sniper development track. Candidates who qualify at a certain performance level enter the training pipeline for sniper certification. That's what most candidates come here for. That's what most candidates assume they're being evaluated for." "And the second pipeline," she said. He looked at her. "The second pipeline is smaller, more selective. It feeds into an advanced marksmanship instruction and development program. Classified in its operational details, but the basic function is this. We identify shooters who don't just perform at an elite level, but who think about shooting in ways that advance what we know about the discipline. The kind of people who develop new methodology, new technique, new frameworks." He paused. "The kind of people who collect 6 days of meteorological data independently and then use real-time impact analysis from other candidates' shots to build a correction model that nobody in this program has ever used before." Avery was very still. "How many candidates has that program taken?" she asked. "In the last 5 years, 4. And what's the age floor?" Mercer looked at her directly. 22, he said. "It's been 22. The silence that followed was the kind that carries weight. "You're recommending an exception," she said. "I'm recommending they look at the parameters," he said carefully. "Those are different things. But the person you called wasn't immediately receptive." "No, who was it?" Mercer shook his head slightly. "That's not a conversation for tonight." She accepted that. "What do I need to do?" she asked. He studied her. "What makes you think there's something you need to do?" "Because there's always something," she said. "The record on the board is mine. The data is documented. The result is verified, and someone still said no. Which means the objection isn't about performance. It's about something else. And whatever that something else is, that's what I need to address." Mercer said nothing for a long moment. "Then you're right again." He came back to his desk and sat down. "The objection is about precedent. Taking someone into AMD at 19 sets a parameter shift that has institutional implications beyond this assessment. There are people who believe the age floor exists for developmental reasons, not just experience in the field, but psychological maturity, the capacity to handle what the program involves. And you disagree that age is the right proxy for that capacity," he said. "I've seen 26-year-olds who weren't ready. I've seen what you did this week." He paused. "But I'm not the only voice in this. Who else is?" He looked at her for a moment. "Commander Patricia Walsh," he said. "She runs Amity. She has final authority on candidate selection. She's the one who raised the age parameters concern. Has she seen my assessment record?" "She will when I submit the report tomorrow morning." "Is there anything else she should see?" Avery asked. "Beyond the range results?" Mercer tilted his head slightly. "What did you have in mind?" "My methodology," she said. "Wind logging system, the Gus cycle analysis, the real-time impact correction model. If her concern is developmental maturity and readiness, then showing her how I think might be more informative than showing her what I scored." Mercer looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Write it up," he said, "tonight. Every step of your methodology from the moment you arrived to the moment you fired the record shot. How you built the model, what data you used, how you made decisions under time pressure. Be precise. Be honest. Include the things that didn't work as well as the things that did." "How long do I have?" He glanced at the clock. "Report goes out at 800, he said. "If you want something included, I need it by 600. She stood up. "Thank you, Master Chief." "Don't thank me yet," he said. Walsh is not easy to move. I'm not trying to move her, Avery said. I'm trying to show her accurate information and let her make a better decision. Mercer looked at her with an expression she would spend a long time thinking about afterwards, something between professional respect and something older and quieter than that. Something that belonged to a different category of feeling entirely. Your father trained you well, he said. She nodded once. Then she left and went to write the most important document of her 19-year-old life. She worked until 445. The methodology document ran to 14 pages. She wrote it the way her father had taught her to write field reports: direct, precise, without decoration, but with full transparency about her reasoning process at each step. She included the gust cycle discovery and the 5-second window analysis. She included the vegetation shear point identification from day 2 and the reasoning behind it. She included the real-time impact correction model and every data point that fed it, including whose shots had given her what information and exactly how she had used it. She included one section she almost cut twice. It was the section about her father. She wrote about where the methodology had come from, about the ballistic tables he had built in theaters without existing data, about the principle that the environment always gives you information if you know how to receive it, about the Saturday mornings on hillsides that had built the foundation of everything she had done this week. She wrote it factually without sentiment, because sentiment would have made it smaller than it was. But she let the facts carry their own weight, because the facts were heavy enough. She titled the section "The Curriculum." At 530, she knocked on Mercer's door. He was already at his desk. She handed him 14 pages. He took them, looked at the page count, looked at her. "Go sleep for 90 minutes, he said. "You look like someone who's been awake all night." "I have been awake all night," she said. 90 minutes, he repeated. "That's an order, not a suggestion," she went. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about Commander Patricia Walsh, a person she had never met, who was sitting somewhere right now, making a decision that would change the shape of Avery's life in one direction or another. She thought about what Mercer had said: Walsh is not easy to move. She thought about whether she wanted to be the kind of person who needed to move people. Her father had never tried to move anyone. He had simply worked, consistently, and with total commitment until the quality of the work made the argument on its own behalf. He had told her once that the most effective thing a person could in any institutional setting was to make their excellence impossible to categorize as anything other than what it was. People will try to find a way to explain what you do as something other than what it is, she had said. Give them enough data that they run out of alternative explanations. She had given Walsh 14 pages. She had given her a week of range results. She had given her a center hit at a distance that had stood untouched for 11 years. She had run out of data to give. Whatever happened next was Walsh's decision to make. Avery accepted that. She closed her eyes and did not sleep, but she rested, which was a different thing, a state she had learned to access during long stalks when sleep wasn't possible but the body still needed to recover. Her father had called it quiet readiness, the ability to be completely still without being absent, present without being tense. She practiced quiet readiness until 700, when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. The message read, "Assessment area, 730. Come alone." Walsh. Avery stared at the message for 10 seconds. Then she got up, dressed, and went to find out what Commander Patricia Walsh was actually made of. Walsh was standing in the assessment area when Avery arrived at 727. She was not what Avery had constructed in her imagination overnight. She had assembled from the bare facts available AMID commander, institutional authority, objection to age parameters, a mental image of someone formal and distant, the kind of military officer who relates to institutional rules as if the rules themselves are the point, rather than instruments for achieving something beyond them. Walsh was not that. She was perhaps 50 compact in the way of someone who had stayed physically capable long past the age when many people stopped trying. Her uniform was immaculate. Her bearing was the natural kind, not performed for effect, but simply the way she stood, the posture of someone who had been in difficult situations, often enough that stillness had become her default mode. She was holding 14 pages. "You wrote this last night," Walsh said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Between what time and what time?" 2100 to 0445. 7 hours and 45 minutes. Walsh looked at the pages, then at Avery. "You wrote 14 pages of technical methodology in 7 hours and 45 minutes, after completing a Day 7 qualification that included breaking an 11-year range record." "Yes, ma'am." Why? Avery considered the question carefully. "Because Master Chief Mercer told me your concern was developmental readiness, not performance. I can't show you readiness through a score. I can only show you how I think." Walsh looked at her steadily. That's a sophisticated distinction for a 19-year-old. I've had time to think about it, Avery said. You've had one night. I've had 4 years, Avery said. Since my father died. I've been preparing for this assessment, and whatever comes after it, for 4 years. The decision about whether I'm ready isn't one I'm making for the first time this morning. Walsh was quiet for a moment. Sit down, she said. They sat across from each other at the assessment table. Walsh set the 14 pages between them and looked at the section titled The Curriculum. Your father built a teaching methodology from field experience, she said. And you completed that curriculum independently after he died. Yes, ma'am. The foundation was in place at 15. I've been building on it since then, alone with competition results as feedback, Avery said. And range work. I would try something, fire, observe the result. Just the environment was my instructor. Walsh looked at her. Do you know what AMIT actually does, she asked. Not in operational detail, Avery said. But from what Master Chief Mercer described developing methodology, advancing the discipline, I think I understand the general function. The general function, Walsh repeated slowly, is that we take the people who think about shooting differently and we ask them to codify it. Write it down. To turn individual insight into transferable curriculum. Into something we can teach. She held up the 14 pages. You've already done that, she said. For your own methodology. In one night, my father showed me that knowledge only matters if it can be transmitted, Avery said. A technique you can't teach dies with the person who invented it. Walsh looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked a few steps away, the way people do when they're thinking through something that has enough dimensions to require physical movement. The age floor exists, she said, because AMIT candidates go into environments that are operationally complex. They advise on active programs. They interact with people at senior levels who don't always respond well to youth. Capability question isn't the hard part, it never was. The hard part is whether a 19-year-old can navigate institutional complexity without a longer track record to back them up. You mean whether people will take me seriously, Avery said. I mean whether you can make them take you seriously, Walsh said. Consistently. Over time. In rooms where the first thing everyone sees is your age. I've been doing that my entire life, Avery said quietly. Since I was 12 years old on a range where the other shooters were adults. Since I was 17 at Benning competing against active-duty qualified snipers. She paused. The first thing everyone sees when I walk into a room is never going to be the right thing. I've accepted that. My job is to make sure the second thing they see is accurate. Walsh turned and looked at her. Something shifted in Walsh's expression, not softness, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has had the exact same experience and has spent years developing the exact same strategy for managing it. How tall are you? Walsh asked. Avery blinked at the question. 5'4". I'm 5'3", Walsh said. I've been the smallest person in every operational room I've ever entered. A pause. I became AMIT commander by being the person who was impossible to dismiss. Not by being liked. By being right consistently about things that mattered. She came back to the table. She picked up the 14 pages. This is right, she said. The gust cycle analysis, the vegetation shear point identification, the real-time correction model. This is genuinely new methodology. I've read every AMIT candidate submission in the last 6 years. This is better than most of them. Avery held very still. I'm not lifting the age floor, Walsh said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not setting a precedent that any 19-year-old who performs well at an assessment can access this program. The floor exists for reasons that remain valid, I understand, Avery said. What I'm doing, Walsh continued, is exercising the exception authority that exists within the parameter framework. That authority has been used twice before in the program's history. Both times in retrospect it was the right call. She set the pages down. She looked at Avery. I'm going to ask you one question, she said, and I want you to think before you answer it. Yes, ma'am, if I bring you into this program, Walsh said, you will be the youngest person in it by 3 years. You will be working alongside people with combat experience you don't have. You will be accepted to contribute at a level equal to or exceeding your peers on day one. And there will be people inside the program and outside it who will be looking for any reason to confirm the belief that this decision was a mistake. She paused. Knowing all of that, do you want this? Avery didn't answer immediately. She thought about it. She thought about the 4 years she had spent on ranges alone, firing into the silence of a world that didn't yet know what she was. She thought about the weight of the Barrett across her back on a 4-mile movement course in desert heat. She thought about 14 pages, written between 2,100 and 445, hands moving steadily through the night, not because anyone required it, but because the work required it, and the work was the only thing that had ever felt like the right answer. She thought about her father, about what he had said the last time she had seen him shoot, the last range day before his heart had stopped working, when he was already slower than he used to be, and the rifle was already heavier than it had been, and he had made the shot anyway, clean and unhurried, and he had looked at her afterward with an expression that she had spent 4 years trying to fully decode. She thought she finally understood what it meant. "This is what we are," the expression said. "This is what we do. Not because it's comfortable. Because it's true." She looked at Walsh. "Yes," she said. "I want." Walsh held her gaze for 5 seconds. Then she nodded. "Report to the AMID facility at Coronado in 14 days, she said. "You'll receive the formal orders through Mercer's office." She paused. "Bring the notebook." "The meteorological log, all of it," Walsh said. "Everything you've built. The curriculum your father started and you've finished. That's what we're bringing you in to help us with." Avery looked at her. "You want me to teach it," she said. "I want you to formalize it," Walsh said. "Build it into something we can transmit. Something that outlasts one shooter on one range in one assessment." She looked at the 14 pages one more time. "Your father understood that knowledge dies with the person who holds it. Let's make sure his doesn't." The words landed somewhere in Avery's chest that was not quite definable. She sat with them for a moment. Then she stood, came to attention. Said, "Yes, ma'am." Walsh returned the nod. "Dismissed, Callahan." She walked out of the assessment area into the full heat of the desert morning, and the sun was already working with serious intent on anyone foolish enough to stand in it without cover, and she walked through it without noticing the temperature, because she was thinking about 14 days and Coronado and a notebook full of wind data and a curriculum that her father had started building when she was 8 years old and that she had been finishing ever since. Caldwell was waiting outside. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and he straightened when she came out, and he looked at her face with the careful attention of someone trying to read a result they're not certain of. "Walsh," she said. "Walsh," she confirmed, and she looked at him. 14 days, she said. He stared at her. "She took you into aid?" "She exercised exception authority," Avery said precisely. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "Do you know how many people have gotten into that program by exception authority?" he said. 2 before today," she said. "How do you know?" Walsh told me. He shook his head slowly. "Or 19, he said. "I'm aware," she said. 19, he said again, and this time it sounded entirely different from every previous time he had said it. Chada's missile. Something closer to awe, which was an emotion Caldwell did not display comfortably, and the discomfort made it feel more genuine. "Ryan," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He looked at her. "What you said last night," she said. "About my father." He waited. "Thank you," she said. "That mattered." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something more and couldn't locate the right words, which was, she suspected, not a condition he experienced often. She picked up her case. "Take care of your rifle," she said, "and listen to what the wind's actually doing, not what you think it should be doing." She walked toward the parking area. He watched her go. Okafor came to stand beside him. "Menbid." "Mid," Caldwell confirmed. Okafor was quiet for a moment. "Going to change something," he said, "in how we do this." Caldwell watched Avery's figure get smaller against the flat desert light. "She already did," he said. They stood there in the heat, and neither of them said anything else, and the range behind them was quiet now, the Barrett silent in its case. The record board updated, the wind moving through the desert the way wind always does, indifferent and honest and available to anyone patient enough to read it. The assessment was over, and somewhere in an office at Coronado, a decision had been made that would set in motion a series of events. None of them could fully anticipate, events that would test Avery Callahan in ways the range never had. In rooms where the weapon was not a rifle, and the target was not a steel plate, and the wind was not something you could measure with an anemometer. She drove out of the range facility with her notebook on the passenger seat, and the Barrett loaded into the truck bed, and 14 days standing between her and whatever came next. She drove with both hands on the wheel, and her eyes forward, and the morning sun coming in hard from the east, and she thought about what her father had said the very first time he had handed her a rifle and asked her to fire. "Don't think about hitting it," he had said. "Think about understanding it. The hit is just proof that you understood it correctly." She thought about what she needed to understand next. Turned onto the highway, she drove. 14 days passed faster than she expected and slower than she could stand. She spent them in her apartment in Coronado doing 2 things simultaneously, building the formal methodology document that Walsh had asked for, and trying to prepare herself psychologically for what she was walking into. Those 2 tasks turned out to be related in ways she hadn't anticipated, because writing down everything she knew, every principle, Every technique, every framework her father had built and she had extended, forced her to confront exactly how much of it lived only in her body and her instincts and had never been translated into language that another person could actually use. Her father had taught through demonstration, through repetition, through the kind of patient, accumulated correction that happens over years between two people who trust each other completely. He had never written a lesson plan. He had never organized what he knew into sequential structure. He had simply known things deeply and completely and transmitted them through proximity and example. Turning that into formal curriculum was harder than breaking the record had been. She worked at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning most nights. She made coffee she forgot to drink. She filled pages and crossed them out and started again. She called Marcus twice not for help with the methodology, but because she needed to hear a voice that had known their father, that carried some of the same frequencies, that reminded her where the knowledge had come from when the distance between the kitchen table in Coronado and a hillside in the high desert felt too large to cross alone. "You're overthinking it," Marcus told her on the second call. "I'm not overthinking it, I'm under-organizing it." "Same problem," he said. "Dad didn't teach you by organizing it, he taught you by doing it. Write down what he did, not what he was trying to do." She held that thought for a long time after she hung up. Then she went back to the table and started the document over. This time it came out right. She arrived at the AMID facility at Coronado at 7:55 on a Tuesday morning, 14 days after Walsh had said the words 14 days in an assessment area in the Arizona desert. The facility was not what she had imagined. She had expected something that looked different from the rest of the base, something that announced its own significance. It looked like every other administrative and training building she had ever been in. Functional, institutional, deliberately unremarkable. What was remarkable was the people inside it. She signed in at the front desk and was escorted to a conference room where 4 people were already seated. And she walked in and felt the specific quality of attention that a room full of experts directs at a new person not hostile, not welcoming, but assessing. The automatic involuntary evaluation that happens when someone whose capabilities you don't yet know enters a space you're used to controlling. She recognized it. She had felt it on every range she had ever walked onto since she was 12. She sat down. Walsh was at the head of the table. To Walsh's right sat a man Avery didn't recognize mid-40s. The kind of physical stillness that comes from years of operational experience. A name tape that read Decker. To Walsh's left, a woman in her mid-30s with the focused, slightly impatient energy of someone who processes information faster than most conversations move. Her name tape read Santos. At the far end, a man who might have been 60 or 45, depending on which part of his face you looked at, with hands that had clearly done serious physical work for a long time, and eyes that were doing exactly what Avery's eyes did in a new environment, cataloging everything without appearing to. Name tape read Kowalski. "Callahan," Walsh said. "You know why you're here. The people in this room know your assessment results, and they've read the methodology document you submitted. What they don't know is you. So we're going to spend the first part of this morning letting them form their own opinion." She paused. "Decker." Decker leaned forward. "Walk me through the gust cycle analysis," he said. "Not the methodology write-up version. The version where you're actually standing on the range at 600 with a hand anemometer and figuring it out in real time. What were you thinking when you started seeing the pattern?" Avery looked at him. "I wasn't thinking about a pattern yet," she said. "I was just collecting data. My father taught me that you collect first and interpret second. If you're looking for a pattern before you have enough data, you find the pattern you expect instead of the one that's actually there." Decker's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "At what point did you start seeing the cycle?" he asked. 40 minutes in," she said. "The anemometer readings had been irregular for the first 30. Then I noticed that the irregularity had a rhythm to it. Not consistent enough to be obvious, consistent enough to be real." "How did you distinguish between genuine rhythm and confirmation bias?" Santos asked from across the table. "Sharp, direct, no preamble. I gave myself a null hypothesis," Avery said. "I assumed the rhythm wasn't real and looked for the data that would disprove it. If the cycle timing held across 5 consecutive observations, I accepted it as real. If it broke, I discarded the model and started over." Santos wrote something down. "Did it break?" she asked. "Once," Avery said, "at the 50-minute mark. The cycle was 18 seconds instead of 17. I almost discarded the model. Then I realized the 18-second instance coincided with a surface temperature change. The sun had cleared the ridge at that moment, and the ground temperature spiked about 2 degrees. The thermal pulse disrupted the base cycle briefly. It returned to 17 seconds within 90 seconds. The room was quiet. Kowalski, who had not yet spoken, said, "You tracked that in real time." I noted the sun position in my log, she said. The correlation was visible in the data afterward. How old are you, he said. 19, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Your father, he said. Scout Sniper. He trained indigenous forces in Afghanistan. Yes, I know his work, Kowalski said. I was in theater during his second rotation. I never met him directly, but I heard about his data collection methods. The field ballistic tables he built without standard reference data. He paused. Those tables saved lives. People were using them years after he left. Avery held very still. I didn't know that, she said quietly. Most people don't, Kowalski said. The work gets used without attribution. That's usually how the best methodology travels quietly. Through practice, without anyone remembering where it started. He looked at her steadily. You're where it started. The room was very quiet. Walsh let the quiet sit for a moment, then said Santos. Assessment. Santos set down her pen. The Gus cycle methodology is genuinely novel, she said, speaking to Walsh but watching Avery. I've reviewed every EMID candidate submission in the last 4 years. No one has applied real-time impact analysis from concurrent shooters as a correction mechanism. It's obvious in retrospect, of course, you use available data. But nobody formalized it, she paused. The question isn't whether the methodology is valuable. The question is whether she can teach it. I can teach it, Avery said. Santos looked at her. That wasn't a question directed at you, I know, Avery said. But it's a question I can answer, so I answered it. Santos held her gaze for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. Why are you confident you can teach it, she asked. Because I've already written it down, Avery said. In a form that someone who doesn't already know it could follow. That's the first step. The second step is watching someone else try to apply it and identifying where my explanation failed them. My father taught me that you don't understand what you know until you try to teach it. The teaching reveals the gaps. And when you find the gaps, Santos said. You fill them, Avery said. You revise, you test again. You iterate until the student's result matches the instructor's result under the same conditions. Santos wrote something down. Decker looked at Walsh. Walsh said Kowalski. Kowalski put both hands flat on the table. I have one question, he said, and it's not about methodology. All right, Avery said. Broke a record that belonged to Mercer, he said. Mercer is the person who recommended you for this program. Some people would say those two facts create a complicated dynamic. Mercer gave you the platform to exceed him. How do you think about that? Avery considered it. I think Master Chief Mercer put the target where it was because he wanted to know if the shot was real, she said. Not for my benefit. For the program's benefit. He wanted to know whether the record distance represented the outer limit of what was achievable, or whether it represented the outer limit of what anyone had tried. And the shot confirmed it wasn't the limit, she said. It was just where the data had stopped. I provided the next data point. Does Mercer resent you for it? No, she said. He told me his record existed to be broken. He meant it. How do you know he meant it? Because he moved the target himself, she said. He didn't have to do that. The assessment was already concluded. He moved it because he wanted to see the answer. That's not the behavior of someone protecting a record. That's the behavior of someone conducting a test. Kowalski looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Walsh. I'm satisfied, he said. Walsh nodded. She looked at the table. Decker, she said. Datev said Decker. Santos. Santos put her pen down. I want her on the curriculum development project, she said. The wind reading module has needed revision for 2 years. Nobody in this room has produced methodology novel enough to justify rebuilding it from the ground up. She looked at Avery. You have. Walsh looked at Avery. You'll be assigned to Santos's team, she said. Your primary task for the first 90 days is formalizing the methodology into teachable curriculum structured, sequenced, testable with defined performance metrics at each stage. Lance will supervise the process. Kowalski will evaluate the final product. She paused. Any questions? One, Avery said. Go ahead. When do I start? Walsh almost smiled. You already have, she said. The first week inside AMID was the hardest week of Avery's life, including the assessment week, including the 4 years she had spent training alone after her father died. It was hard in a way she hadn't anticipated because the hardness wasn't physical and it wasn't technical. It was social and institutional and interpersonal, and those were domains where the skills her father had built in her didn't translate directly and where she had to find her footing in real time without a model to follow. The EMID team was 8 people in total, including Avery. The other 7 ranged in age from 24 to 51. Every one of them had operational experience she didn't have. Every one of them had been in environments where the work they did here had been tested against real consequences, real targets, real costs. They were professional and correct in their treatment of her from the first day. They were not warm. There's a specific kind of professional correctness that is colder than hostility, because hostility at least acknowledges your presence as something worth reacting to. Professional correctness of the particular variety Avery encountered in that first week said, "We are treating you according to the standards that apply to everyone here. And whether you belong here is a question your performance will answer, and we are not going to prejudge the answer in either direction." It was fair, it was also lonely. She ate lunch alone for the first 4 days. Not because anyone excluded her, no one did anything that obvious or that petty, but because the social clustering of the team happened naturally around shared experience. And she didn't yet have shared experience with any of them. And she didn't want to insert herself artificially into conversations she hadn't earned her way into. Fonts noticed on day 3. She came and sat across from Avery at the small table in the corner of the break room where Avery had been eating alone, and she set down her coffee and her food and she looked at Avery with the direct, uncushioned attention that seemed to be her default mode. "You're isolating," Santo said. "I'm being patient," Avery said. "Those look the same from the outside. They're not the same from the inside." Avery looked at her. "How do you know the difference?" she asked. "Because I did the same thing my first month in a unit, where I was the only woman and the youngest person by 4 years, Santos said. "And I called it patience, too. My supervisor called it something else." "What did he call it?" "A waste of energy," Santos said. "He told me that the people in the room had already decided to give me a fair shot. They were waiting for me to stop deciding they hadn't." She picked up her coffee. "You're doing the same thing. You've already decided they're skeptical. So you're behaving in a way that confirms there's distance between you, which makes them maintain the distance, which confirms your original assumption." Avery considered that. "Is it not true that they're skeptical?" she said. "Of course it's true," Santos said. "They're always skeptical of new people. That's not about you specifically. The skepticism ends when you've contributed something real. You can't contribute something real if you're eating alone in the corner and moving through the building like you're trying not to disturb anything." She stood up. "Come eat with Decker and Kowalski," she said. "Decker tells a story about a shot he missed in 2009 that he's told 400 times, and it gets funnier every time, because he adds details. Need to hear it." "Why are you doing this?" she said. Santos picked up her tray. "Because Walsh brought you here for a reason," she said, "and you being lonely in the corner is a waste of the reason." She paused. "Also, you remind me of myself at your age, which is either a compliment or a warning depending on how you look at it." Avery picked up her tray and followed her. Decker's story about the 2009 miss was, in fact, very funny by the fourth telling, which was the version Avery heard. It involved a wind miscalculation, a goat that had wandered into his field of fire at precisely the wrong moment, and a senior instructor who had watched the entire thing from the observation post and whose only comment had been to write in the after-action report, "Candidate demonstrates creative target selection." Avery laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since she arrived. Kowalski watched her laugh and said, "There she is." She looked at him. "Sure. The person who built that methodology," he said. "I couldn't figure out where she went after the conference room. She was there for the first 2 hours and then disappeared." He picked up his coffee. Good to have her back. Avery didn't know exactly what to do with that. She did what she always did when she didn't know what to do. She filed it away to think about later, when she had enough quiet to process it properly. What she did know was that something had shifted at that table. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible from the outside. But the distance that had existed between her and the rest of the team contracted by some meaningful degree, and the quality of the remaining distance changed from the cold kind to the provisional kind, the kind that says we're still evaluating but without the chill that implies the evaluation is a formality covering a decision already made. That evening, Santos stopped by her workspace. Avery was deep in the wind-reading curriculum draft, surrounded by printed pages and annotated range data and the original 14-page methodology document she had written in the apartment in Coronado. Santos looked at the spread of material. "How far are you?" she asked. "Module 1 is close," Avery said. "The environmental data collection framework, the anemometer protocol, vegetation indicator system, the gust cycle identification methodology. That's structured and sequenced. I have performance metrics for each stage." "Module 2, the real-time impact correction model, is harder to formalize," Avery said, "because it requires the student to have other shooters' results available. And in a training context, that means we need to structure the exercises so multiple students are firing simultaneously, which changes the logistics of how the qualification sequence runs." Santo sat down. "What would you need to make that work?" she asked. "Modified exercise format," Avery said. "Instead of individual qualification shoots, Students fire in groups of 4 or 5. Each student observes the other's impacts in real time and uses those data points to refine their own calculation before their turn. The exercise becomes collaborative in the data collection phase and individual in the firing phase. Santos was quiet for a moment. That's a significant departure from how we run qualification sequences, she said. I know, Avery said, but the current format doesn't allow students to practice the skill in conditions that reflect how it actually works. In a real environment, you almost always have access to other data preceding shots. Observable impacts, pattern information from the environment. The current format trains students to operate without that data, which means they're training for a narrower set of conditions than they'll actually face. Santos looked at her. You've been here 6 days, she said. I know, Avery said. Is that too soon to be saying this? Santos looked at the curriculum spread on the desk. Say it to Kowalski tomorrow, she said. Exactly the way you said it to me. Don't soften it. He might not like the implication that the current format is suboptimal, Avery said. He won't like it, Santos confirmed. He helped design the current format 12 years ago. She paused. Say it anyway. Kowalski doesn't want agreement. He wants the truth. He's been waiting 12 years for someone to tell him what's wrong with that format. She stood up. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. Kowalski's reaction to Avery's proposed qualification format change was not what she expected. She had prepared for resistance. She had pre-built her argument, anticipated the likely objections, organized her evidence in order of weight. She had done this the way she did everything systematically, thoroughly, with the assumption that the environment would push back, and she needed to be ready for the push. Kowalski listened to her for 4 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've known for 6 years that the isolation format was wrong. I didn't have a replacement that was better in a way I could prove. Avery waited. You have a replacement, he said. And you can prove it? I can design a test, she said. Run the current format with one group and the collaborative format with a second group under the same conditions. Compare results at the end of the module. How long would the test take? 1 assessment cycle, she said. 6 weeks. He looked at Walsh, who had been listening from the back of the room. Walsh said, design the test. Avery looked at her. You have 6 weeks, Walsh said. If the results support the format change, we move forward. If they don't, we document what we learned and adjust. She paused. That's how methodology development works. You propose, you test, you evaluate. Welcome to the program. The 6 weeks that followed were the most intellectually demanding period of Avery's life. He was designing a test while simultaneously building the curriculum the test was meant to evaluate, while simultaneously learning the operational context that the curriculum was meant to serve, while simultaneously navigating a team dynamic that was still finding its equilibrium around her presence. She was doing 4 things at once, and none of them could wait for the others. She slept 5 hours most nights. She ran 6 miles every morning because her father had taught her that physical discipline was the foundation that held everything else up when the pressure increased. And the pressure had increased. She ate lunch with Decker and Kowalski and Santos every day. She learned that Decker had a daughter who was studying engineering and whom he talked about with a pride so large it barely fit in the room. That Kowalski had been offered a civilian position 3 times and had declined all 3 because, as he put it, the work here isn't finished. That had transferred into Emmett from an operational unit after taking a round in the right shoulder that had ended her field career and started, as she described it, the more interesting part. She learned things about people that she hadn't expected to learn, because she hadn't expected people to become legible to her this quickly in this kind of environment. Her father had told her, pay attention to what people are proud of. That's where they live. She paid attention. And the team, without quite deciding to pay attention back. 3 weeks into the test cycle, something happened that none of them had planned for. One of the test group students, a Marine Scout Sniper candidate named Alvarez, 24 years old, 4 years of service, solid fundamentals, pulled Avery aside after a session and said something that changed how she understood what she was building. The impact correction model, he said. The part where we use other students' shot data to refine our calculation before we fire. What about it? She said. I used it yesterday, he said. Not here, back in my unit. We had a practice range session and I watched 2 other shooters engage before my turn, and I used their impact data to build a wind correction the way you taught, and I hit center on a shot I've missed 6 times before. She looked at him. Times. Same range, same distance, same approximate conditions, he said. I kept missing it about 4 inches left. Yesterday I hit center, because I watched Martinez miss it 4 inches left before my turn, and I corrected 4 inches right before I fired. She was quiet for a moment. Used a real shot in a real session, she said. Yes, he said, and it worked. Yes, he said again. He paused. I just thought you should know. She thought about her father, about the principle that knowledge only matters if it can be transmitted. She thought about Kowalski saying that her father's tables had saved lives. In theater, years after he left, without anyone knowing where the tables had come from. She thought about a methodology that started on a hillside with a 12-year-old girl and a patient man who loved her, and that had traveled through 4 years of solitary range work, and a 7-day assessment and a 14-page document written in the night, and that had now moved through a classroom exercise into a real unit's real practice range and changed a real result. Thank you for telling me, she said. Thank you for building it, he said. He walked back to the group. Avery stood alone for a moment. Then she opened her notebook. She didn't write anything. She just held it. She thought about the weight of a Barrett M107 across her back on a 4-mile movement course in August heat. She thought about the moment before the record shot when the vegetation went still and she pressed the trigger. She thought about every person who had said 19 like it was a diagnosis. She thought about Walsh saying, let's make sure his doesn't. His, her father's, the curriculum, the knowledge. She closed the notebook. She went back to work. The test results came in at the end of week 6. Mantos compiled the data. Kowalski reviewed the analysis. Walsh read the summary report. The collaborative format group had outperformed the isolation format group by a margin that Santos described, in the dry language of evaluation reports, as statistically significant and operationally meaningful. The center hit rate in the collaborative group was 31% higher at distances beyond 1,500 yards. The error rate on wind correction calculations was 44% lower. The time to competence metric, how many training sessions a student needed to reach consistent performance at assessment level distance, was compressed by nearly 2 weeks. Walsh called the team together. She read the summary numbers without commentary. Then she said, format change approved. New qualification sequence to be implemented in the next assessment cycle. She looked at Avery. Document the methodology, she said. Full curriculum write-up. Sequenced and tested. I want it in the program library within 30 days. Yes, ma'am, Avery said. Callahan, Walsh said. Ma'am, do you understand what you've just done? Avery thought about it honestly. I think I've changed how the program teaches wind reading, she said. You've changed how the program teaches wind reading, Walsh said. Every candidate who comes through this facility from the next cycle forward will learn a methodology you developed. Some of them will go into the field and use it under conditions where the alternative was a miss. Some of those misses would have had consequences. She paused. You are 19 years old. That is what you have just done at 19 years old. The room was quiet. Decker said, her father's going to need a bigger notebook. It broke the tension in the way that Decker's contributions always did, sudden, perfectly timed, exactly calibrated to the emotional temperature of the room. Avery looked at him, and she did something she had not done in front of this team before. She laughed and her eyes filled, and she let both things happen simultaneously without choosing between them. Because her father would have done exactly the same thing, and she was only now fully understanding more like him than she had realized. Kowalski watched her and said nothing for a moment. Then he would be proud of this. She nodded. She couldn't speak for a moment. She didn't try. She just let it be what it was, the accumulated weight of 4 years of solitary work and a record broken in the desert, and a 14-page document written in the night, and 6 weeks of building something real inside a program that hadn't been. Sure, she belonged, all of it settling into her at once, finding a place to rest. Then she picked up her pen. She had 30 days to write the curriculum. She had already started. The curriculum document took 26 days, not 30. She had finished 4 days early, which surprised Santos and didn't surprise Kowalski, who had watched Avery work long enough to understand that her relationship with deadlines was the same as her relationship with target distances. She identified the outer limit, calculated what it would take to reach it, and then worked backward from there with enough precision that she usually arrived ahead of schedule. The document was 63 pages. It covered 3 modules: environmental data collection, gust cycle identification, and real-time impact correction. Each module had structured lesson sequences, defined performance benchmarks, annotated range exercises, and a testing protocol that allowed instructors to evaluate student progress at each stage before advancing to the next. There was an appendix that cross-referenced the methodology with existing ballistic literature and identified specifically where the new framework departed from conventional wind reading instruction and why. Walsh read it in one sitting. She called Avery into her office the following morning and set the document on the desk between them and looked at it for a moment before she said anything. This is the best curriculum submission this program has received in its history, she said. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest of what I'm going to tell you. Avery went still. When someone prefaces something with "before I tell you the rest is never small. The Naval Special Warfare Command has reviewed your assessment results, your EMID performance record, and the curriculum document, Walsh said. They've reviewed the test cycle data, comparing the collaborative qualification format to the isolation format. They've reviewed Kowalski's evaluation of your methodology and Mercer's original recommendation. She paused. They want to offer you a formal role within EMID, Avery said. Beyond EMID, Walsh said. She opened a folder on her desk. There's a program, she said. It doesn't have a public name. Internally, it's called the Marksmanship Development Initiative, MDI. It was proposed 3 years ago as a way to systematically advance long-range engagement capability across NW by building and distributing methodology developed by practitioners rather than theorists. And underfunded and understaffed since it was proposed. She paused. Command wants to properly resource it. They want to appoint a program lead. Avery looked at her. I'm 19, she said. I'm aware, Walsh said. The age floor for AMID was 22, and you exercised exception authority to bring me in, Avery said. What's the age floor for a program lead position in MDI? There isn't one, Walsh said. MDI is a new structure. The parameters are being written now. Avery was quiet. They're being written around me, she said slowly. Walsh looked at her directly. The position exists because the work you did in 6 weeks demonstrated something that the program has needed for 3 years. That is not an accident of timing, that is cause and effect. Who else is being considered? Avery asked. No one, Walsh said. The word landed quietly and with enormous weight. Avery looked at the folder on the desk. What would the role involve? She said. Building MDI from the current proposal into an operational program, Walsh said. Recruiting practitioners whose field experience has produced methodology worth formalizing. Overseeing curriculum development across multiple workstreams simultaneously. Interfacing with Admin Command on program direction and resource allocation. She paused. And continuing your own development as a shooter and methodologist. We're not asking you to stop being what you are in order to become an administrator. We're asking you to do both. Who would I report to? Avery said. Me, Walsh said. For the first year after that. Direct to NUB's command, depending on how the program scales. Avery sat with that for a moment. He thought about a 19-year-old who had driven away from an Arizona assessment range 26 days ago with a notebook on the passenger seat and a 14-day deadline and no clear picture of what came next. She thought about how much had changed in 26 days. She thought about Alvarez telling her that he had used the impact correction model in a real session and hit a shot he had missed 6 times. She thought about the word scale, about the reach of a methodology that didn't stay in one place. There will be people who object, she said to the age. To the precedent. Yes, Walsh said. How serious are the objections? Serious enough that the offer comes with a condition, Walsh said. Avery looked at her. A probationary structure, Walsh said. 12 months. MDI operates under direct supervision with quarterly reviews. At the end of 12 months, Command makes a permanent determination based on program performance. She paused. If the program performs, the supervision structure lifts and MDI operates independently. If it doesn't perform, we revisit the appointment. What defines performance? Avery said. I want you to define it, Walsh said. That's the first thing I need from you in this role. What are the metrics that would prove at 12 months? MDI is doing what it's supposed to do. Avery looked at her. You want me to build my own evaluation criteria, she said. I want you to own the accountability, Walsh said. One can be handed a position. The person who defines what success looks like, and then delivers against that definition, is a different kind of leader. Avery was quiet for a long moment. Din picked up the pen from Walsh's desk. May I, she said. Walsh nodded. Avery turned to a blank page in the folder and wrote 3 lines. She pushed it back across the desk. Walsh read it. The 3 lines said 1. Measurable improvement in wind correction accuracy across all SW assessment candidates who complete MDI curriculum versus baseline. 2. At least 2 independently developed methodology contributions from MDI recruited practitioners within 12 months. 3. 0 cases of curriculum adoption failure traceable to documentation or training gaps in MDI. Walsh read it twice. Then she said that last one. If a student can't use the methodology correctly, the failure is in how we wrote it, Avery said, not in the student. The curriculum carries the responsibility for its own comprehensibility. That's a very high bar, Walsh said. My father held himself to that bar, Avery said. He rebuilt tables when the results weren't tracking. He didn't blame the shooters who were using them. Walsh looked at the 3 lines for a moment. And she closed the folder. Welcome to MDI, she said. The announcement went through NSW channels the following week. Avery didn't see most of the reactions directly, but she heard about them. Santos filtered the most significant ones to her in the straightforward way that Santos did everything, without softening and without editorializing, just the facts in the order they mattered. The reaction from Mercer was the first one Santos told her about. He called Walsh, Santos said. She told me he said 3 words when she informed him of the appointment. What 3 words? Avery said. Santos looked at her. I knew it, she said. Avery was quiet for a moment. That's it? That's it, Santos said. Then he asked if he could visit the program in 6 months to see how it was developing. Walsh said yes. Avery thought about the man who had moved the target 147 yards beyond where any candidate had been tested before, who had stood on an observation platform and watched her fire, who had updated the record board himself and asked Rodriguez to confirm twice. He knew, she said. He saw it before anyone else did, Santos agreed. The second reaction, Santos reported, was from a rear admiral whose name Avery recognized from institutional communications, a man who had been, according to Santos, among the strongest voices raising concerns about the age of the appointment. He had read the 63-page curriculum document. He had reviewed the test cycle data. He had called Walsh and asked one question. Is she the one who designed the collaborative qualification format? Walsh had said yes. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then he had said the format change alone saves us 6 weeks of training time per assessment cycle. That's resource allocation efficiency I've been trying to achieve for 4 years. Another pause. Tell her to make the program work, Walsh had told Santos. Santos had told Avery. Avery had written it in her notebook under the day's date without comment, the way she recorded any significant data point. The third reaction came from a direction she hadn't expected. Caldwell called her on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the MDI announcement. She saw his name on her phone and answered on the second ring. Ryan. I heard about MDI, he said. Word travels fast, she said. It is not a large community, he said. Word travels at the speed of text message. A pause. How are you working, she said. Obviously, he said. Are you sleeping some, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to tell you something, he said. And I didn't want to do it through channels. I wanted to tell you directly, all right, she said. I've been thinking about what you said on day 6, he said. In the mess hall. When you said you didn't come here to beat me. You came here to make a shot, I remember, she said. I've been shooting competitively for 11 years, he said. I've never thought about it that way. I've always thought about it as a competition. The target is the thing between me and the other person, he paused. After watching you fire, I went back to my unit and I ran a range session differently. I told the other shooters on my team to share their impact data in real time, before anyone had heard about your curriculum. I just tried it because I watched you do it. She said nothing. She was listening. 3 shooters on my team, who had been consistently missing at 1,800 yards, hit center that session, he said. All 3, first time. Because we were sharing information instead of protecting it. She was quiet. I wanted you to know that the methodology worked before you had a program, he said. Before you had a title. Before any of the institutional structure. It worked because it's true. Avery held the phone and looked at the wall of her small office, which was covered in the annotated range data and curriculum drafts and wind pattern charts that had become the texture of her working life. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Your father built something real, Caldwell said. You need to know that people are using it, I know, she said quietly. She stopped. What? I didn't expect it to move this fast, she said. From a range in Arizona to team sessions in your unit. I thought it would take years to propagate. Good methodology moves fast, he said. Because the people who use it immediately see results, and then they tell other people, and those people try it, and it moves. You didn't design a technique. You changed how people share information on a range. That's a much larger thing. She sat with that. Are you still carrying the Barrett, he asked. She almost smiled every day. Good, he said. Don't let anyone take it away from you. No one's trying, she said. No, he said. I don't suppose they are anymore. He hung up. She sat in her office for a few minutes after the call, holding the phone, not doing anything else. Then she opened the notebook. She wrote Caldwell. 3 shooters, 1,800 yards, center. Impact correction model field validated independent replication. Involvement. She underlined the last 3 words. To independent replication, the methodology was moving on its own. The first quarterly review came at week 13. Convened the review board herself, Kowalski, Decker, Santos, and 2 SW's command representatives Avery hadn't met before, a captain named Reeves and a civilian program evaluator named Dr. Farouk, who wore the specific expression of someone accustomed to reviewing institutional programs and finding them wanting. Avery presented the program data herself. She had prepared for 3 days. Not because she was afraid of the presentation. She had given enough range briefings, enough methodology explanations, enough curriculum justifications over the past 13 weeks, that speaking in front of this table felt like a technical exercise rather than a performance. She had prepared because the data was complicated, and she wanted to present it in a way that made its implications impossible to misread. She started with Metric 1, Wind Correction Accuracy Improvement. The assessment candidates who had completed MDI curriculum showed a 28.6% improvement in center hit rate at distances above 1,500 yards compared to the pre-MDI baseline for the same candidate profile. The Gust cycle methodology alone accounted for approximately 60% of that improvement. The impact correction model accounted for the remaining 40%. Farouk looked at the numbers. "How are you controlling for candidate variability?" he said. "The candidates this cycle might simply be better shooters than the baseline group. We ran the same baseline fundamentals assessment on both groups before MDI curriculum exposure," Avery said. "The entry-level scores were statistically equivalent. The post-curriculum gap is attributable to training, not selection." Farouk wrote something down. She moved to Metric 2, Independently Developed Methodology Contributions. "We recruited 3 practitioners in the first quarter," she said. All 3 had field experience that had produced informal techniques they had been using in their units without formal documentation. We formalized 2 of those techniques and integrated them into supplementary curriculum modules. The third is still in development." "What are the 2 techniques?" Reeves asked. "A thermal layer identification method developed by a Marine sniper during 3 Afghanistan deployments," she said. "He had been accounting for thermal drift empirically without understanding the physics. We worked with him to build the physics framework around his empirical observation, which made it teachable to shooters who hadn't developed the intuition through years of field experience." She paused. "The second is a moving target lead calculation refinement developed by a Navy SEAL during maritime operations. He had adapted standard lead formulas to account for vessel movement patterns that are different from land-based moving targets. It's now in the advanced engagement module." The room was quiet. Kowalski said, "You found a Marine and a SEAL with field-developed techniques that nobody had ever formalized." "There are more," Avery said. "I've identified 6 additional practitioners whose field experience has produced informal methodology worth examining. We can absorb 2 more in the next quarter without overextending the program's current capacity." "How did you find them?" Santos asked. "I asked," Avery said simply. "I sent inquiries through unit channels asking if anyone had developed range techniques informally that they hadn't seen in any official curriculum. The response rate was higher than I expected." "How much higher?" Reeves said. 23 responses in the first 3 weeks, Avery said. "From 9 different units." Reeves looked at Walsh. Walsh's expression was composed and revealed nothing. Avery moved to Metric 3, 0 curriculum adoption failures traceable to documentation or training gaps in MDI materials, she said. All assessment candidates who completed the MDI curriculum demonstrated correct application of the methodology and qualifications exercises. Where performance gaps existed, we identified them as pre-curriculum fundamentals deficiencies rather than MDI-specific failures, and we flagged those candidates for additional foundational work before re-enrollment. Farouk looked up from his notes. "You built a triage system," he said. "The curriculum can't carry students who aren't ready for it," she said. "Identifying the readiness threshold is part of ensuring 0 adoption failures. If we enroll students who aren't ready and they fail to apply the methodology correctly, that's a curriculum design failure on our end, not a student failure. Solution is better intake assessment, not revised curriculum." Farouk looked at her for a long moment. "How old are you?" he said. It was the question she had been answering her entire life. She had heard it at 12 with a rifle on a hillside. She had heard it at 17 at Benning. She had heard it on a firing line in Arizona from a man who'd said it like an accusation. She had heard it from everyone who had ever needed to locate her inside a category before they could figure out how to respond to her. 19, she said. Farouk wrote something in his notes. Then he looked at Reeves. "I've reviewed 47 program evaluations in the past 6 years," he said. "I have never seen a first quarter report at this level of analytical precision." He paused. "I have concerns about long-term leadership capacity in a program that will scale beyond its current size. I do not have concerns about the program's current performance." Walsh said. "Noted." She looked at Avery. "The board will deliberate," she said. "You'll have the outcome by end of day." Avery stood, gathered her materials, and left the room. She went back to her office. Sat down, she waited. The outcome came at 1,614 hours. Walsh appeared in the doorway of Avery's office without knocking and stood there for a moment. "Probationary structure lifted," she said, "effective immediately." MDI operates under independent authority from this point forward with scheduled reporting to NSW command. She paused. Reeves also recommended a resource increase. You're getting 2 additional staff positions. Farouk recommended an expanded recruitment budget. Avery looked at her. Farouk, she said. The one with concerns about long-term leadership capacity, he also said. And I'm quoting directly because the language is unusual for him. The program will scale as far as the person running it decides to take it. My recommendation is that we get out of her way. Walsh paused. It is the most positive evaluation Farouk has issued in 3 years. I've worked with him since 2019, and I have never heard him use the phrase, get out of her way. Avery was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what comes next? Walsh came into the office and sat down across from her. That depends on you, she said. MDI is resourced and cleared. The methodology is validated. The curriculum is in the program library and being adopted by assessment candidates. Format change is implemented and producing results. You have practitioner recruitment underway and 2 techniques already formalized. She looked at Avery directly. What do you want to build next? Avery thought about the 6 practitioners she had identified who hadn't yet been absorbed into the program. She thought about the 23 unit responses to her initial inquiry and the informal techniques living inside those units that had never been written down, had never been transmitted, would die with the practitioners who had developed them if no one collected them first. She thought about her father's tables used in theater without attribution, saving lives without anyone knowing where they came from. She thought about Kowalski saying, the work gets used without attribution. That's usually how the best methodology travels quietly, through practice, without anyone remembering where it started. She thought about what it would mean to change that, to build a program that collected methodology before it disappeared, that put names to techniques, that preserved the knowledge that practitioners spent careers developing and that currently vanished when they retired or transferred or died. She thought about her father, about what it would mean to make sure that never happened again. I want to build a field methodology archive, she said. A systematic collection of practitioner-developed technique from across all NSW units. Not just the techniques that rise to the surface, all of them. Every informal adaptation, every field correction, every adjustment that a shooter made in theater, and passed to the next person by demonstration rather than documentation. She paused. I want to collect it before it disappears. Formalize it. Test it. Distribute it. Walsh studied her. That's a 10-year project, she said. Probably longer, Avery said. But you start it the same way you start everything else. You collect the data, you build the model, you fire when the window is right. Walsh looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her expression that was different from the composed professional regard she maintained in most interactions, something older and more personal, the look of someone who recognizes in another person the thing they have spent their own career trying to do. Write the proposal, Walsh said. I'll take it to command. She stood up. Callahan, she said. Ma'am, your father's curriculum. The one you described in the methodology document. Foundation he built before he died. And you finished alone. She paused. When this program grows to the point where we're training instructors, I want that curriculum in the foundational sequence. Tributed. Avery looked at her. James Callahan, Master Sergeant retired, Walsh said. His name goes on the material. The work gets attributed to the person who built it. She paused. That's how we make sure the best methodology doesn't travel quietly and without attribution. We put the name on it. Avery was still. The thing she felt in that moment was not a simple emotion. It was layered grief and gratitude and pride and something that had no precise name but that felt like the sensation of a long calculation finally resolving into a clean answer. The feeling of mathematics completing. She'd spent 4 years carrying her father's knowledge inside her body like something borrowed that she wasn't sure she had the right to keep. She had translated it, ended it, tested it, formalized it. She had fired his methodology out of the barrel of a Barrett M107 at a distance no one had reached before, and she had used it to change how a program taught wind reading, and she had carried it into a room where 23 units had responded to a single inquiry about informal field technique. She had done all of that, and now someone was going to put his name on it. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady. He earned it, Walsh said simply. She left. That evening Avery called Marcus. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting, which meant the news had already traveled. MDI, he said immediately. Independent authority, new resources, tell me. How did you hear? She said. Caldwell called me, he said. He heard through unit channels. He said Walsh told Mercer. Mercer told it doesn't matter. The point is everyone knows. A pause. You want to tell me anyway. Start from the beginning. So she told him. She told him about the quarterly review and Farouk and the phrase, get out of her way. She told him about the Field Methodology Archive proposal and the practitioner recruitment and the 23-unit responses. She told him about Walsh saying his father's name would go on the curriculum. Marcus was quiet for a long time after that. She let the quiet be what it was. He would have hated having his name on something, Marcus said finally. She smiled. I know. He was the least self-promoting person in any room he ever entered. I know that too, she said. But he would have understood why it matters, Marcus said. Putting the name on it, he would have understood that it's not about him. It's about the next person who finds the work and needs to know where it came from. That's why I said yes, she said. Marcus was quiet again. Then Dad took you to a range for the first time when you were 8 years old. You were too small to hold the rifle, so he built you a rest out of sandbags and you fired from behind that for 2 years until you were big enough to hold it. I remember, she said. He came home that first day and told Mom he'd found out what you were, Marcus said. He said it like it was the most certain thing he'd ever known. I found out what she is, a long pause. He was right. Avery held the phone. Outside the window of her office, the base was going quiet in the way institutional places go quiet at the end of the day gradually. The sounds of activity dropping away one by one until what remained was the ambient hum of a place that was still operational but resting, readying itself for the next day's work. She thought about everything that had happened since a 19-year-old had walked onto a firing line in Arizona with a rifle nearly heavier than she was, and set it down in front of a group of men who had already decided what she was. She thought about the record board with her name on it, about Walsh's exception authority and Farouk's get out of her way, about Caldwell's 3 shooters hitting center at 1,800 yards, about Alvarez using the impact correction model in a real session and breaking 6 misses in a row, about 23 units responding to a single inquiry, about a Marine and a SEAL with field techniques no one had ever written down, about her father's name going into a program library, about knowledge that would not disappear. She thought about the moment before the record shot when the vegetation went still, that 3-second window of clean air, of honest wind, of the environment telling the truth, and she had pressed the trigger, and the answer had been exactly what the mathematics said it would be. She thought about what her father had told her the very first time she had asked him what it meant to really know something. Knowing something means you can transmit it, he had said. It means it lives outside you. It means that when you're gone, it's still here. She looked at the annotated curriculum pages covering her office wall. She looked at the 63-page document in the program library. She looked at the proposal she had just described to Walsh, the Field Methodology Archive that would collect and name and preserve what practitioners built and what institutions forgot. She looked at all of it. She said to Marcus, I need to go. I have a proposal to write, I know, he said. Call me when it's done, it'll be late, she said. I'll be up, he said. She hung up. She opened her notebook to a clean page. She picked up her pen, and Avery Callahan, 19 years old, the youngest program lead in Naval Special Warfare history, carrying a methodology her father had started and she had finished and the institution had now promised to name, began to write the next thing she was going to build. Because the shot was never just the shot. The shot was proof that you understood something correctly, and what she understood, what she had always understood, from the first time a patient man put a rifle in her hands on a hillside and taught her to read the wind, was that the work was never finished. It only moved forward into the hands of the next person, and the next, and the next. That was what her father had built, and what she had carried, and what she would spend her life making sure survived every range and every assessment, and every room full of people who looked at her and said 19 like it was a limit. It was not a limit. It was a beginning, and she had only just started.